In 1978, a satellite passed over a remote mountain plateau in northern Ethiopia. What it photographed stopped analysts cold. Not a city, not ruins, not anything they had a name for. 11 structures carved directly into solid red volcanic rock. Not built on top of it, not assembled from cut stone, carved down into the earth. Like someone had taken the mountain itself and hollowed it out into the shape of a cathedral. Each one different, each one precise, each one decorated with windows, columns, doorways, and drainage channels so sophisticated that modern engineers still argue about how they were made. The largest of them is 40 feet tall and 110 feet long, cut from a single piece of rock. The walls are less than 3 feet thick in places. One crack, one miscalculation during construction, and the entire thing collapses. There are no signs of miscalculation. There are no cracks that were not intended. They were not built by a known empire. They were not built by a civilization with iron tools or pulleys or cranes. According to the official records, they were built in the 12th century by a single Ethiopian king. In 25 years, by hand. Archaeologists have looked at the math. They've measured the volume of rock removed. They've calculated the number of workers that would have been needed. They've run the numbers on how long it would take. The numbers don't work. Not even close. And that's where it starts. That's where this story begins. Not with the answer to how they were built, because nobody has that answer, but with the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. The question that local priests have been answering the same way for 900 years. They didn't build them, they say. God did. Angels came down and worked through the night while the humans slept. Every morning, the workers would arrive to find that more had been done in the darkness than they had accomplished in the previous full day of labor. That's not a metaphor. That's not a parable. That's not a legend passed down around fires. That is the official, recorded, historical account from the people who were there. And here's the thing. When you stand in front of Bete Medhenalem, the largest rock-hewn church on earth, when you look up at the columns carved from the same single piece of volcanic rock as the floor beneath your feet and the ceiling above your head, when you run your hand along a wall that has stood for 900 years without mortar or reinforcement, the angel story stops sounding impossible. It starts sounding like the only explanation that makes sense. This is Lalibela, and nothing about it is simple. The town of Lalibela sits at an elevation of about 8,200 feet in the Lasta Mountains of northern Ethiopia. The air is thin. The landscape is dramatic. Red rock cliffs rise on every side, cut through by gorges that drop suddenly and without warning. Most people who visit do so by small propeller plane from Addis Ababa. The flight takes about an hour. Looking down from the air, the highlands of Ethiopia look ancient in a way that most places don't. The shapes of the land feel old. The colors feel old. The light, coming sideways through thin air at high altitude, feels like light from a different era entirely. The town itself is small, about 15,000 people, dusty roads, stone houses, eucalyptus trees planted in rows to prevent erosion on the steep hillsides, donkeys carrying loads of firewood, priests in white robes moving along narrow paths with wooden crosses in their hands, and then set into the earth as if they have always been there, as if they grew there like volcanic formations, as if the mountains simply decided one day to take the shape of worship, are the churches. You don't see them from the road. You have to walk to the edge of a trench and look down. And what you see when you look down doesn't fit neatly into any category your brain has prepared for it. The churches of Lalibela are not ruins. That's the first thing that surprises people. They are not the remnants of something that once was. They are not archaeological sites in the usual sense, places where what you are seeing is mostly foundation and wall stump and inference. They are whole. They are intact. They are in use. Every day, priests celebrate the liturgy inside them. Every morning, worshippers descend into the trenches, cut into the earth around the churches, and press their foreheads against walls that have been pressed against in exactly this way for 900 years. The smell of frankincense, the sound of drums, the low, ancient chanting of the Ge'ez liturgy, a language that has not been spoken as a mother tongue for well over 1,000 years. Preserved in these mountains, the way rock preserves a fossil, in the shape it always had, unchanged. There is no other place on Earth quite like this, not in terms of scale, or age, or continuity, or the particular combination of the archaeological and the living and the sacred that Lalibela contains all at once. The site is divided into two main groups of churches, connected by a tunnel carved through the rock. The northern group contains 7 churches. The southeastern group contains 4. An outlier, the Church of St. George, stands slightly apart and is the most photographed, the most visited, and in many ways the most astonishing of all 11. Each church has its own character, its own proportions, its own specific carving vocabulary. Some are nearly freestanding monoliths, attached to the surrounding rock face only at the base. Others are carved directly into cliff faces, their facades emerging from the rock like faces from water. Some are connected by tunnels and passages that run through the rock in darkness. Some have interior rooms that go deeper into the mountain than is immediately apparent from outside. The site covers roughly 30,000 square meters. The volume of rock removed to create it is estimated at several million cubic feet. Think about that number. Several million cubic feet of solid volcanic rock, removed by hand, shaped, not just excavated, into one of the most complex and refined architectural sites in the history of the world. How long would that take? The official answer is 25 years. The real answer may be something entirely different. His name was Gebre Meskel Lalibela. He lived sometime in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. He was a king of the Zagwe dynasty, which ruled Ethiopia during a period when the older Aksumite Empire had collapsed and before the later Solomonic dynasty would come to power. The story of his birth is the first thing that marks him as unusual. According to Ethiopian tradition, when Lalibela was born, a swarm of bees surrounded him in his cradle. His mother interpreted this as a sign and named him Lalibela, which means in the Aga language something like the bees recognize his sovereignty, or in a more literal translation, he who the bees honor. Bees in Ethiopian Christianity carry a particular symbolic weight. They are associated with the divine order, with the structure of heaven, with the idea that there is a higher architecture behind the visible world. The swarm around the infant king, in the context of what he would eventually build, reads now like an origin story that knew where it was going. His brother, a king named Harbe, was so threatened by the prophecies surrounding Lalibela that he had the young prince poisoned. The poison, the story goes, sent Lalibela into a deep sleep for 3 days, during which time he was carried by angels to the first, second, and third heavens, where he was shown the churches he was meant to build in full detail, already complete, waiting for him to replicate them on earth. When he woke, he began to build. This is the traditional account. It has been repeated continuously, without significant variation, for the better part of 9 centuries. Now, whether you believe in angels or not, whether you believe in divine visions or 3-day poisoned sleeps or heavenly architecture tours, the story tells you something important about the churches themselves. It tells you that even the people who built them understood them as something that originated outside normal human capacity. The story was not invented to explain a failure of records. The story was told by the builders themselves, passed down by the direct communities who participated in the construction, as the explanation for something they had witnessed and could not otherwise account for. The angel's story is not a myth retrofitted onto history. It is a historical account given by primary sources. That doesn't mean it's literally true, but it means the people who were there felt that something had happened that their normal vocabulary couldn't contain. What could produce that feeling? What could a 12th century person see happening around them that would make the most intelligent, the most educated, the most observant people of their time conclude that the explanation had to be supernatural? There are several theories. We'll get to them, but first, let's understand what was actually built. Modern architects and engineers have spent decades studying the churches of Lalibela. The more they study them, the more impressed they become. And the more confused. Let's start with the basics. Rock-hewn architecture is not unique to Lalibela. There are rock-cut temples in India at Ellora and Ajanta. There are rock-cut tombs in Petra. There are cave churches scattered across Christian Ethiopia and across the early Christian Middle East. Humans have been carving spaces into rock for as long as humans have been making things. But Lalibela is different from all of these in a way that matters. The difference is this. The churches of Lalibela are not carved into a cliff face. They are not hollowed out of a hillside from one side. They are surrounded, on all sides, by open air, by trenches cut into the earth, by courtyards excavated from the living rock, so that you can walk around the church, look at all four walls, look at the roof, look at the drainage channels cut into the base. They are freestanding structures. They just happen to be made from the same piece of rock as the mountain they stand in. This is an engineering challenge of a completely different order than any other type of rock-cut architecture. When you carve a temple into a hillside, you start from the outside and work in. You can see what you're doing. You can correct mistakes by going deeper. You have the whole face of the rock as your working surface and the rock behind you as your safety net. When you create a freestanding monolithic church, you do something closer to the opposite. You have to remove rock from all four sides simultaneously. You have to maintain the walls as you go, constantly reassessing their thickness, constantly checking that the structure remains stable. You are working on a three-dimensional problem from the outside in and the top down at the same time. You cannot correct a mistake. If you remove too much rock from one wall, the wall is thinner than it should be. You cannot add it back. If you cut too deep on one side and create a structural imbalance, the whole thing can fail. And by fail, I mean collapse, irreversibly, forever. The precision required is extraordinary. Now, consider what the workers at Lalibela had access to. They had iron chisels and wooden mallets. They had fire, which they could use to heat rock and cause it to crack along predictable lines. They had water, which they could use in combination with heat to accelerate cracking. They had ropes and wooden levers for moving large pieces of removed stone. They did not have measuring instruments of significant precision beyond simple plumb bobs and basic right-angle tools. They did not have the ability to calculate structural load distribution by formula. They did not have cranes. They did not have scaffolding in any substantial sense, since the structures they were building were being revealed from the surrounding rock rather than assembled from components. And yet the structures they produced are architecturally sophisticated in ways that still impress trained engineers in the 21st century. Take the drainage system. Water is the enemy of carved stone. Water finds cracks, expands them, undermines foundations, erodes surfaces. The red volcanic tuff that Lalibela is carved from is relatively soft and relatively porous. Without effective drainage, the churches would be vulnerable to water damage on a significant scale. The builders of Lalibela solved this problem with a drainage system that has kept the churches largely intact for nearly 9 centuries. They carved channels around the bases of the structures to carry runoff away. They carved the floors of the surrounding courtyards at angles that direct water toward these channels. They designed the relationship between the structures and the rock faces around them to minimize water pooling. This system works. After 900 years, it still works. Modern engineers who have assessed it describe it as elegant and entirely effective. How do you design a drainage system in the 12th century? Not a basic drainage channel, which is simple enough. A system. A coordinated, multi-part system that anticipates water flow patterns across a complex landscape and addresses them comprehensively and permanently. You do it through observation, through accumulated knowledge, through a tradition of engineering practice that has been developed and refined over time. You do it through genius. You do it through help that we don't fully understand. Or you do it, as the locals have always said, because you were shown how. The structural engineering of the roofs is equally impressive. Most of the churches have flat roofs carved from the same piece of rock as the rest of the structure. These roofs carry their own weight, plus the weight of soil that accumulates on them, plus the pressure of rainwater during the rainy season. The way this weight is transferred down through the walls and into the rock is a function of how thick the walls are, how they are supported by interior columns, and how the overall geometry of the structure distributes load. Get any of these calculations wrong, and you have a collapse. The churches of Lalibela have not collapsed, not in 900 years, not even partially. The original geometry, worked out without structural engineering software, without advanced mathematics, without anything except experience, intuition, and the accumulated knowledge of a tradition, has proven entirely sound. The interior columns of Bete Medhane Alem, the largest church, demonstrate this with particular clarity. The church is divided by 2 rows of columns into a nave and 2 side aisles. The columns are monolithic with the rest of the structure. They carry the weight of a roof that spans a space 40 feet wide and 110 feet long. The proportions of the columns, their height relative to their diameter, relative to the spacing between them, were calculated to produce exactly the right amount of support. After 9 centuries, they are doing exactly what they were designed to do. One wrong calculation, one column slightly too thin, one spacing slightly too wide, and that roof would have come down centuries ago. It didn't. Let's do the math. The volume of rock removed to create the 11 churches and the trenches, courtyards, and passages surrounding them is estimated by archaeologists at somewhere between 2 and 4 million cubic feet. Let's use the lower number, 2 million cubic feet of solid volcanic rock. Now, a skilled worker with a chisel and mallet in the 12th century, working in volcanic tuff of the type found at Lalibela, can remove maybe 3 to 5 cubic feet of rock per day. That's on a good day, with good tools, in a position that allows effective work. 2 million cubic feet divided by 4 cubic feet per worker per day gives you 500,000 worker days of excavation. 500,000 worker days. Not including the shaping, the finishing, the carving of decorative elements, the cutting of windows and doorways, the creation of the drainage channels, the work on the interior spaces. Just the raw excavation. 500,000 days. Now, Lalibela supposedly built his churches in 25 years. That's 9,125 days. 500,000 divided by 9,125 is approximately 55. So you need at least 55 workers working every single day for 25 years just to remove the raw rock. And that's with no days off, no rest, no illness, no turnover. But wait, most of the excavation at Lalibela could not be done by 55 workers simultaneously. The trenches around the freestanding churches, for example, are in many places only wide enough for 1 or 2 workers side by side. The work at the base of the structures, close to where walls meet floors, requires careful, precision work that cannot be done in crowds. So you need more time, not less. Some estimates suggest that the construction of the Lalibela complex, using 12th century technology and 12th century workforce sizes, would have taken between 300 and 400 years, not 25. Not one king's reign, 3 to 4 centuries. Now, there is a counter-argument to this. Archaeologists have noted that the different churches at Lalibela show different construction techniques and different stylistic characteristics. Some researchers believe that the site was not built all at once, that it was developed over a much longer period than traditional accounts suggest, with different churches built at different times by different rulers. This is entirely possible. Ethiopian historical records from this period are not comprehensive, and the Zagwe dynasty's timeline is imperfectly understood. It is quite conceivable that what we call Lalibela's churches were actually the work of multiple kings over multiple generations, with Lalibela himself being one major contributor among several. But even this interpretation doesn't fully resolve the engineering mystery, because even if you distribute the work over 300 years, you still have the same basic question. How did people working with iron chisels and wooden mallets produce structures of this architectural sophistication? How did they maintain quality and consistency across centuries? How did they solve engineering problems that modern engineers admire as genuinely clever solutions? The time problem is one mystery. The knowledge problem is another, and they are different problems. More time doesn't give you better engineering. It just gives you more time to make mistakes. The churches of Lalibela are not the result of more time. They are the result of better knowledge than we can fully account for. The angel story, in its full form, is this. King Lalibela, having received his vision of the heavenly churches he was meant to replicate on earth, began construction with a large workforce. The workers labored during the day. They made progress, but the work was difficult, the rock resistant, the scale enormous. Then something changed. Every morning, when the workers arrived at the site, they found that more had been done in the night than they had accomplished during the full previous day of labor. The tools showed signs of use. The rocks showed signs of fresh cutting, but no one had seen any workers during the night. The priests, and eventually the king himself, realized that angels were completing the work after dark, that the construction of the churches was happening on 2 shifts simultaneously, the human shift during the day and the divine shift at night. This story has been told at Lalibela continuously since the 12th century. It is told not as legend but as historical record. The Ge'ez texts that describe the construction of the churches include this detail without apology or qualification. It is presented as what happened, as the witnessed reality of people who were there. Now, what do you do with this? The options are roughly as follows. First option, it's literally true. Angels are real, divine intervention is real, and the churches of Lalibela were built with supernatural assistance. This is what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church teaches, what the priests at Lalibela believe, and what millions of Ethiopian Christians accept as historical fact. Second option, the story is a later fabrication, added to the historical record to explain the inexplicable. This is what many Western scholars have historically assumed. The problem with this interpretation is that the story appears in the earliest written records of the construction, not in later glosses or embellishments. Third option, something real happened at the construction site that the witnesses interpreted as supernatural, something they saw or didn't see, or heard or didn't hear, that convinced them that the work was being done by non-human agents in the dark. The third option is the most interesting, because it opens up the question of what exactly could produce that conviction in intelligent, observant people in the 12th century. There are a few possibilities worth considering. One is the use of specialized workers, craftsmen brought in from outside Ethiopia, from somewhere in the broader medieval world, who worked different hours than the local workforce, who used different techniques, who were unusual enough in their appearance or their methods that they inspired a different explanation. There are, in fact, tantalizing hints in the historical record of exactly this kind of outside influence. We'll return to those in a moment. Another possibility is that the story preserves, in symbolic form, a genuine phenomenological reality. The experience of arriving at a site and finding that progress has happened that cannot be accounted for by normal means. This experience might not require supernatural agents to produce. It might be the result of exceptional productivity, of workers and supervisors who were so skilled and so motivated that they achieved things their contemporaries could not fully account for. There is a third possibility, which is stranger and more interesting than either of the first two. What if the angel's story is not metaphor and not fabrication and not misidentification, but an account of a genuine technological capability that has since been lost? We'll come back to that. But first, let's look at who was around in the 12th century. In the broader world, who might have had something to do with what happened at Lalibela? Ethiopia in the 12th century was not isolated. This surprises many people. The image of Ethiopia as remote, inaccessible, cut off from the main currents of medieval civilization is partly true and partly a projection backward from later periods of Ethiopian history when the country did become more isolated. In the 12th century, Ethiopia was connected to the wider world through several significant networks. The most important of these was Christianity. Ethiopian Christianity is old, genuinely old. The tradition holds that Ethiopia converted to Christianity in the 4th century through the ministry of Frumentius, a Phoenician scholar who became the first bishop of Aksum. By the 12th century, the Ethiopian church had been Christian for nearly 800 years. It was in communion with the Coptic Church of Egypt, which maintained a continuous relationship with the Ethiopian church throughout the medieval period. The Coptic connection mattered enormously for what was happening at Lalibela. Egypt, in the 12th century, was a crossroads. The Crusader kingdoms occupied Jerusalem and much of the Levant. Islamic scholars were at the height of a golden age of intellectual and technical achievement. Coptic Christians maintained communities throughout Egypt and had connections extending to Jerusalem, to Constantinople, to the rest of the Christian world. And Egypt had something else that matters for our story: a long, deep tradition of stone masonry. The people of the Nile Valley had been carving, cutting, and shaping stone with extraordinary sophistication for thousands of years. The knowledge accumulated over those millennia had not disappeared. It had been adapted, refined, and handed down through the communities that continued to live and work along the Nile. There is evidence, tantalizing and suggestive but not conclusive, that workers from Egypt and possibly from farther afield were present at Lalibela during its construction. The evidence comes partly from the architectural details of the churches themselves. Some of the windows at Lalibela use decorative motifs that appear in Aksumite Ethiopian architecture, the older tradition that preceded the Zagwe dynasty. But some windows use motifs that are strikingly similar to Coptic Christian decorative vocabulary of the 11th and 12th centuries. Some of the crosses carved into the churches use forms that are specifically Ethiopian, but some use forms with parallels in Armenian Christian art, or in the art of the Crusader kingdoms, forms that you would not expect to find in Ethiopia without some channel of transmission. The architectural vocabulary of the churches is not purely local. It is a synthesis, which means that whoever designed and built them had access to knowledge and stylistic traditions from outside Ethiopia. Which means there was contact, direct or indirect, between Lalibela's builders and a broader world of architectural knowledge. This is not proof of foreign workers. It could be the result of Ethiopia's craftsmen studying illuminated manuscripts or other artistic objects that carried these motifs. Medieval knowledge transfer worked in many ways, but it is consistent with the idea that the construction of Lalibela drew on technical and artistic knowledge that was not purely indigenous to the highlands of northern Ethiopia in the 12th century. And there is one group, one specific and historically documented group, that might have been at the center of this. The Knights Templar were established in Jerusalem in 1119, about 50 years before Lalibella's construction is believed to have begun. They were a military, religious order, one of the most powerful and well-resourced organizations in the medieval Christian world. But they were not just soldiers. They were engineers. They were builders. They were the people who designed and constructed the extraordinary fortifications of the Crusader kingdoms, the castles and tower keeps and fortified cities that still stand in modern Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. The engineering expertise of the Templars was remarkable and widely recognized. They also had, by virtue of their role as the guardians of pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem, an extraordinary network of contacts across the Christian world. They maintained houses in Portugal, France, England, Italy, the Byzantine Empire, the Crusader states. They were in contact with Islamic engineers and scholars. They were at the intersection of multiple strands of medieval technical knowledge, and they were in contact with Ethiopian Christianity. The Ethiopian church maintained a presence in Jerusalem. Ethiopian Christian monks had a community there that dates back centuries before the Crusades, during the period of Crusader control of Jerusalem, from 1099 to 1187. Ethiopian monks and pilgrims were present in the city and had relationships with the various Christian military orders who controlled access to the holy sites. The Knights Templar would have known about Ethiopia. They would have known about its Christian king. They would have known about the project of building churches that was underway in the Ethiopian highlands. Some researchers have gone further than this, arguing that the Templars were actively involved in the construction of Lalibela, that they sent engineers and craftsmen to assist the Ethiopian king, either as a diplomatic gesture or as part of a broader strategy of building Christian alliances across the known world. There is no documentary proof of this. The kind of Templar archive that would confirm direct involvement does not exist, partly because the Templars were suppressed and destroyed in the early 14th century, and their records were largely lost or deliberately destroyed. But the architectural evidence has attracted serious attention. The plan of the Church of Bete Golgotha at Lalibela contains proportional relationships that are also found in Templar churches in Europe. The plan of Bete Gabriel Rufael has been compared to plans used in Hospitaller and Templar construction in the Levant. These comparisons are not superficial. They involve specific ratios, specific spatial relationships, specific structural solutions. Coincidence is possible. Shared precedent is possible. Both traditions may be drawing on older common sources, but the consistency of the comparisons across multiple churches, across multiple specific details, has led a number of architectural historians to conclude that something more than coincidence is likely. The most interesting version of this theory suggests that the Templars didn't just send craftsmen to Lalibela. They sent the plan. They had access to, or had developed, a system of sacred geometry, a set of proportional relationships and spatial principles derived from their study of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and they exported this system to Lalibela as a gift to a fellow Christian king. If this theory is correct, the angel's story takes on a different resonance. Imagine looking at the progress made by foreign craftsmen, working with tools and techniques you haven't seen before, using methods that seem to achieve in a night what your local workers achieve in a week. You might call them angels, too. Sacred geometry is not magic, but it looks like magic if you don't know what it is. The idea behind sacred geometry is that certain proportional relationships are more than aesthetically pleasing. They reflect something deeper about the structure of reality. They appear in nature, in the growth patterns of plants, in the spiral of a nautilus shell, in the structure of crystals, in the orbits of planets. The ancient world which did not distinguish between mathematics and theology in the way the modern world does, understood these proportions as evidence of divine order made visible. The most famous of these relationships is the golden ratio, 1 to 1.618. It appears in the Parthenon, in the Great Pyramid, in Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, in the proportions of the human body, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. Whether you think this means something cosmically significant, or whether you think it's an interesting coincidence, it is undeniably present in an extraordinary range of architectural and natural contexts. Medieval cathedral builders understood sacred geometry in a very practical sense. They used it as a system of proportional relationships that could determine everything from the overall plan of a building to the dimensions of individual decorative elements. Working from a few key measurements and a few key ratios, a medieval master builder could generate the dimensions of an entire complex structure, maintaining consistent proportional relationships throughout. This system had several advantages. It was reproducible, meaning that different builders in different places, working from the same initial specifications, could produce buildings with consistent spatial character. It was scalable, meaning that you could work from a small drawing to a large building while maintaining proportional accuracy. And it was teachable, meaning that you could transmit it through instruction and demonstration to craftsmen who didn't necessarily understand the underlying mathematics. If the builders of Lalibela were working within such a system, a lot of what seems mysterious becomes more tractable. The consistency of the architectural vocabulary across the different churches, the way they feel related to each other, despite being individually distinct, could be the result of a shared, proportional system applied with variations. The structural sophistication, the columns that are the right thickness in exactly the right places, the roofs that span the correct distances, could be the result of a system that encoded structural intuitions in proportional rules rather than in explicit calculations. And the speed, the apparently impossible speed with which the work progressed, could be partly a matter of efficiency. When you know exactly what you're building before you start, when the dimensions are determined by a system rather than by trial and error, you can work faster, not supernaturally fast, but faster. There is something else about sacred geometry that is worth noting. It produces buildings that feel different from buildings that lack it. They feel calm. They feel complete. They feel, and this is the word that people always reach for, sacred. The churches of Lalibela feel this way. Even to visitors with no particular interest in religion, no special sensitivity to architectural proportions, no prior knowledge of sacred geometry. They feel like places where something important was understood and embodied in stone. That feeling is real. It has a cause. The cause may be exactly what the builders intended, the embedding of a set of proportional relationships that resonate with something in human perception, something that reads as depth, as rightness, as the presence of an ordering intelligence behind the visible forms. If you were a 12th century Ethiopian Christian worker, and you arrived every morning to find that the angels had been at work in the night, what you might have been perceiving, without the conceptual vocabulary to name it, was exactly this: the presence of an ordering intelligence, the work of minds that had access to a system you couldn't see, but whose effects you could feel. That's not so different from what we would say today. The rock at Lalibela is called volcanic tuff, red volcanic tuff to be specific. It is a sedimentary rock formed from compressed volcanic ash and debris, and it has properties that make it both ideal and treacherous for the kind of construction attempted here. The ideal properties: volcanic tuff is relatively soft when first exposed to air. Fresh tuff, rock that has just been cut and exposed, can be worked with iron tools without extraordinary effort. It cuts cleanly. It takes detail work well. You can carve fine moldings, precise window tracery, intricate decorative crosses into freshly cut tuff with tools that would make no impression on granite or hard limestone. the treacherous properties. Once tuff is exposed to air and weather, it hardens. Over years and decades, exposed tuff becomes significantly harder than fresh tuff, more resistant to tools, more brittle. And tuff that is not properly sealed or protected is also vulnerable to water. It can absorb moisture, which expands in the freeze-thaw cycle, creating internal stresses that eventually cause cracking and spalling. These properties together meant that the builders of Lalibela were working against time in a specific way. They needed to complete the detailed carving work while the rock was still soft enough to take it. They needed to work quickly enough in each section to finish the surface treatment before the rock hardened to the point where fine work became impossible. This is another pressure that might explain the urgent, intensive pace of construction. Not just ambition, not just divine mandate, but the physical properties of the material itself creating an imperative to work fast. It also means that the sequence of construction was more constrained than it might initially appear. You couldn't just work wherever was convenient. You had to work in a sequence that allowed you to complete each section of detailed carving before the rock in that section hardened beyond workability. Planning this sequence, maintaining it across a large workforce, coordinating the movement from section to section to section, is a management challenge as much as it is a craft challenge. The master builders of Lalibela, whoever they were, had to be not just craftsmen but also project managers. They had to hold the entire plan in mind, track the state of the rock across dozens of working surfaces simultaneously, and make constant decisions about where to apply effort and where to leave work for later. The volcanic tuff also has one more relevant property, which is that it is consistent. The rock at Lalibela is remarkably uniform in its composition across the entire site. There are no significant variations in hardness, in grain, in the presence of structural faults or weaknesses. This uniformity means that the builders could apply their knowledge of how the material behaved consistently across all their working surfaces without having to constantly adjust for local variations. This made the work easier. Not easy, but easier. The rock behaved the same way every time. In a project as large and as complex as this, that consistency was probably more valuable than it might seem. It meant that the experience accumulated on the first church could be applied directly to the second. The knowledge built up by the workforce over time was fully transferable to new sections of the site because the material was the same, experience with a consistent material compounds. Each church taught the builders something that made the next church slightly more achievable. Over the decades of construction, the workforce must have become extraordinarily skilled. The later churches, assuming the construction proceeded in a roughly chronological sequence that archaeologists have partially worked out, show higher levels of technical refinement than the earlier ones. The decorative carving becomes more complex. The proportional relationships become more sophisticated. The structural solutions become more elegant. The builders were learning. They were getting better. By the time they carved the Church of St. George, the last of the 11 churches and by many measures the most accomplished, they were at the top of their game. They had learned everything that the earlier churches had to teach them, and they applied it to a project that was in some ways simpler than what had come before. A single square tower descending into the earth, but executed with a precision and a confidence that reflect a mastery accumulated over a lifetime of work. St. George's Church is what you build when you know exactly what you're doing. If you have seen one photograph of Lalibela, it is probably of the Church of St. George. It sits in a square pit, 12 meters deep, cut vertically into the red earth. The church itself is a cube, roughly 12 meters on each side, carved from a single piece of rock. Its roof is flat, and from above, when you look down into the pit, the roof is what you see first. A large square surface of stone carved in relief with an interlocking pattern of Greek crosses, large crosses within medium, crosses within smaller crosses, repeated across the entire surface in a design of striking geometric precision. The church is freestanding within its pit. On all four sides, between the walls of the church and the walls of the pit, there is a gap of several meters, enough to walk in, enough to see the church from any angle, enough to appreciate that it is genuinely detached from the surrounding rock on all four sides and above. It is attached to the surrounding rock only at the base, where it is connected to the floor of the pit. The pit floor is level. The drainage channels, carved into the floor at the base of the church walls, direct water away through a tunnel cut in the rock. The floor has been drained effectively for 900 years. The exterior walls of the church are decorated with a blind arcade of arches, carved directly into the stone face. Each arch frames a shallow niche. The proportional relationship between the arches and the wall surfaces between them is careful and consistent. The effect is of a building that knows it is a building, that has absorbed the principle that exterior surfaces should relate to interior spaces in a way that is legible and rhythmical. The doorway is on the north face. It is framed by carved moldings and surmounted by a carved lintel. The carving is precise and controlled. The proportions of the doorway relative to the wall in which it sits are determined by the same system of geometric relationships that governs everything else about the structure. Inside, the church is single-roomed. The walls are decorated with carved niches and simple moldings. The roof is plain, undecorated, but the proportions of the space are such that the plain ceiling feels right, feels correct, feels like the appropriate completion of what the walls have established. The space is small by the standards of great medieval churches. It holds perhaps 100 people in comfort, but the quality of the space is not a function of its size. It is a function of its proportions, its stillness, and the quality of attention that seems to have been brought to every surface. There is a pit cut into the floor at the center of the interior space. It is covered with a wooden grate. Below the grate is water, a spring or the upper reach of an underground water table that has been providing water at this spot since the church was built. The water is considered holy. Pilgrims dip their fingers in it and press them to their foreheads. The story of why this church is dedicated to St. George is as follows. When Lalibela had completed all the other churches, St. George appeared to him and expressed displeasure that no church had been built in his honor. Lalibela promised to build the finest of all the churches for St. George, and he did. The geometric cross pattern on the roof is read as St. George's tribute to the Holy Trinity. George, the dragon slayer, the patron saint of warriors and of England, of Portugal, and of Georgia, his cult was widespread in the medieval Christian world, from Britain to the Levant to the mountains of Ethiopia. His presence at Lalibela is one more thread in the fabric of connections that links this remote highland site to the wider medieval Christian world. The church is in continuous use. Daily services are held inside it. Priests in robes of white and gold conduct the liturgy in Ge'ez before clusters of worshippers who have descended the rock-cut stairway into the pit and pressed themselves against the outer walls of the church. On feast days, particularly on Gena, Ethiopian Christmas, tens of thousands of pilgrims flood into Lalibela from across Ethiopia and beyond, spending the night on the surrounding hillsides, descending to the churches at dawn, filling the air with the sound of drums and sistrum rattles and the ancient chant. What you feel, standing at the edge of that pit and looking down at the Church of St. George, is hard to name precisely. It is not quite awe in the dramatic sense, not the breathless vertigo of looking up at a towering Gothic cathedral. It is something quieter than that, something more intimate. The church is below you, not above. You are looking down at it the way you might look into a well, seeing something at the bottom that doesn't entirely fit the context you've given it. It is too perfect, that's the thing. It is too precise, too controlled, too resolved. You don't expect perfection from the 12th century. You expect the rough edges, the compromises, the evidence of working it out as you went. You expect the past to show its seams. The Church of St. George has no seams. It is sealed, complete, finished. It looks as if it was always there, waiting to be found rather than made, as if the mountain simply revealed it, which is, in a sense, exactly what the builders of Lalibela believed. Here is something that distinguishes Lalibela from almost every other major archaeological site in the world. It is not an archaeological site, not primarily, not in the sense that implies dead things preserved for study. Lalibela is a functioning religious complex. It has been in continuous use since its construction. The churches have never been abandoned. The liturgy has never stopped. This matters in ways that go beyond the symbolic. Because the church is alive, the knowledge associated with it is also alive. There are priests at Lalibela today who have memorized texts in Ge'ez that predate the construction of the churches. There are deacons who have learned the chant traditions handed down through an unbroken line from the 12th century. There are craftsmen who repair and maintain the churches using techniques passed down from their predecessors. The churches themselves are not in the same condition as they were when built. Time, water, and the weight of constant use have required periodic repair. The Zagwe period construction has been worked over, added to, maintained with materials and methods that differ from the original. Some sections of the churches show repairs done in different centuries using slightly different materials or techniques. This is normal for a living building. A cathedral that has been in constant use for 900 years is not the same building it was when it was completed. It carries the marks of all the centuries it has lived through, all the repairs, all the modifications, all the additions made by each generation that inherited it. The priests of Lalibela see this not as a problem, but as an expression of the life of the place. The churches are not frozen objects to be preserved unchanged. They are living buildings, and living buildings change. The UNESCO World Heritage designation, which Lalibela received in 1978, introduced a tension that is still being worked out. The designation brought resources for conservation, which is good. It also brought the framework of archaeological preservation, which tends to treat historic sites as static artifacts to be maintained as closely as possible to a particular historical state. This framework sits awkwardly with a living tradition. The priests have their own understanding of what the churches are and how they should be cared for, an understanding developed over 9 centuries of continuous responsibility for these buildings. The international conservation professionals have a different framework, developed from a set of principles about authenticity and material integrity that were worked out largely in the context of European secular heritage. The negotiations between these frameworks have sometimes been difficult. There have been disagreements about specific interventions. There have been conflicts about who has the authority to make decisions about what. The Italian agency that was contracted to place protective shelters over some of the churches made choices that were criticized by architects and historians as ugly, inappropriate, and potentially damaging to the very structures they were meant to protect. Those shelters are still there, still controversial, still the subject of ongoing debate. This tension is not unique to Lalibela. It appears at any site where a living tradition and a modern conservation framework intersect. But at Lalibela it is particularly acute because the living tradition is itself of extraordinary historical significance, and the buildings are of extraordinary physical fragility. The rock continues to be vulnerable to water. Climate change has altered precipitation patterns in northern Ethiopia. The volume and intensity of tourist visits has increased significantly in recent decades, bringing with it mechanical vibration from vehicles, increased atmospheric humidity from human breath, and physical wear from the millions of hands and feet that touch and walk on surfaces that were not designed for this scale of contact. The future of Lalibela, the physical future of the stone, the continued survival of the churches in their current state, is genuinely uncertain. Not threatened in the immediate term, but not guaranteed in the long term either. The priests who have cared for these buildings for 900 years are aware of this. They have always been aware of it. Their job, as they understand it, is to maintain what they have inherited and pass it on. They have done this in conditions that were sometimes far more dangerous than the present, through wars, through famines, through the Derg regime, through political instabilities that shook Ethiopia to its foundations. The churches stood and the liturgy continued. There is a reasonable expectation that they will continue to stand, but there is also the awareness, quiet and persistent, that nothing physical is permanent, that what has lasted for 900 years will not last forever, and that each generation that receives this inheritance has a responsibility it cannot fully discharge. Something was known at Lalibela that we don't fully know now. This is not a mystical statement. It is a practical one. The people who built the churches possessed knowledge that enabled them to solve engineering and design problems that we can only partially reconstruct. Some of what they knew is recoverable from the buildings themselves. Some of it has been transmitted, partially and imperfectly, through the traditions of the Ethiopian church, and some of it is simply gone. This happens with technical knowledge in general. It is not uniquely associated with ancient or medieval contexts. It happens in the modern world too. There are industrial processes developed in the early 20th century for which the documentation has been lost and which cannot now be fully reproduced. There are crafts that were practiced widely 2 generations ago and are now practiced by a handful of aging specialists. There are flavors, smells, sounds that existed and do not exist anymore and cannot be brought back. Knowledge is fragile. It requires continuous maintenance. It needs to be practiced, taught, used. Technical knowledge that is not actively practiced atrophies and eventually dies. The knowledge that built Lalibela was partly maintained through practice, the ongoing craft tradition of stone carving and church building in Ethiopia, which has never entirely ceased. But the specific combination of knowledge required to produce the churches of Lalibela, the structural engineering, the sacred geometry, the hydraulics, the project management capacity, the artistic vocabulary, no longer exists in a form that would allow them to be replicated. This is not surprising. The circumstances that produced the churches, a powerful and visionary king, exceptional craftsmen, access to wide-ranging technical knowledge, sufficient resources and time, sufficient isolation from the disruptions that plagued the rest of the medieval world, do not exist anymore and cannot be recreated. But the loss is real. What the builders of Lalibela knew about how to make a building out of a mountain, about how to carve space from stone in a way that resonates for 900 years as sacred and true, that knowledge is gone. The buildings remain. The knowledge that made them possible does not. This is one of the things that makes standing at Lalibela such an unusual experience. You are standing in the presence of something that cannot be fully explained by anything that still exists. The gap between what was known and what we know now is visible in the stone. The gap is also a kind of promise. The buildings are there. They can be studied. The techniques that produced them left traces in the rock that can be read by careful observation. The traditions that maintained them for 9 centuries have preserved aspects of the knowledge that built them. It is possible, in principle, that the understanding of how they were made could be reconstructed, not completely, but more fully than it is now. Some researchers are working on this. The interdisciplinary field of archaeomaterials, which combines archaeology with materials science, structural engineering, and computer modeling, has produced increasingly sophisticated analyses of rock-cut architecture in recent decades. The churches of Lalibela have been the subject of laser scanning, photogrammetric surveys, ground-penetrating radar studies, and computational structural analysis. What these studies have revealed is impressive in detail but modest in implication. They confirm that the builders of Lalibela were highly skilled. They reveal specific construction sequences and techniques in particular sections of the site. They map the current state of the stone with extraordinary precision, which is valuable for conservation. But they do not explain the central mystery. They do not account for the knowledge gap. They do not tell us where the design came from, or how the structural calculations were made, or why the buildings feel the way they feel. The mystery survives the science, not as an obstacle to understanding, but as a genuine depth that scientific study has not yet fully reached. Maybe it can be reached, maybe not. Either way, it is there. It is easy, sitting in a modern city, in a culture that tends to treat religion as a private preference and scientific materialism as the default metaphysical framework, to read the story of Lalibela and file the angel explanation under mythology. It is worth pausing on that instinct. The priests of Lalibela are not credulous. They are educated men, educated in a tradition that has been intellectually serious for 1,700 years, a tradition that includes great theologians, philosophers, historians, and poets. The Ethiopian Church has thought carefully about the questions it claims to answer. It has not avoided hard questions. It has engaged them over centuries with rigor and depth. When a priest at Lalibela tells you that angels built these churches, he is not offering you a naive story. He is offering you a position within a theological framework that he understands in considerable detail and has considered from multiple angles. He has thought about what angels are. He has thought about what divine action in the world means. He has thought about the relationship between human effort and divine grace. His answer is not the same as ignorance. It is not what you say when you don't have a better explanation. It is what you say when you have a very particular, very developed understanding of how the world works, and this event fits within that understanding. Now, you may not share that understanding. You may find it unpersuasive. You may, on the basis of your own philosophical commitments, be quite confident that angels did not build the churches at Lalibela. But the intellectual history of certainty about what is and isn't possible is not encouraging. The number of things that were confidently declared impossible that later turned out to be possible is significant. The number of phenomena that were confidently assigned to superstition or ignorance that later turned out to have real and complex causes is also significant. What the priest is doing when he invokes angels is not making a claim about mechanism. He is making a claim about source. He is saying, the power and the knowledge that built these buildings did not originate in human capacity alone. Something beyond normal human capacity was present here. Something that we call, in our tradition, divine. Whether you translate that into theological language or not, the underlying observation is one that modern analysts share. Something extraordinary happened here. The knowledge that made this possible did not come from nowhere. Its source is not fully visible to us. The priest's explanation and the archaeologist's puzzlement are, at this level of abstraction, saying the same thing. The faith of the priests has preserved these buildings for 900 years, not the scientific study, which arrived in the 20th century, not the international conservation framework, which arrived in 1978. The faith, the daily liturgy, the continuous human attention expressed in prayer and incense, and the care of custodians who understood their role as sacred. Whatever your view of what angels are or aren't, that faith is not nothing. It is, in a very direct sense, the reason the churches still exist. Ethiopian Christmas, which falls on January 7th by the Western calendar, the Ethiopian calendar being different, is the most important pilgrimage time at Lalibela. In the days before the feast, pilgrims begin arriving from all over Ethiopia. Many have traveled for days. Some have walked for weeks. The roads approaching Lalibela become crowded with people moving on foot, carrying their food and their sleeping arrangements with them, their white shamas, the traditional cotton cloth wrapping, bright against the brown of the highland roads. By the eve of the feast, the hillsides around Lalibela are covered with white. Tens of thousands of people have made camp. Fires burn. The sound of drums begins in the late afternoon and continues through the night. At dawn, the priests emerge from the churches in full ceremonial regalia. White robes embroidered with gold, ceremonial umbrellas in brilliant colors, crosses of silver and gold held high above the procession. The tablet, the sacred tablet that is the central object of veneration in the Ethiopian church corresponding to the Ark of the Covenant in theological significance, is carried in procession around the church, wrapped in rich cloth, not to be seen by the laity. The chanting fills the cold highland air. The drums are answered by the rattle of the sistrum, the ancient percussive instrument that was already old in pharaonic Egypt and has been used in Ethiopian Christian worship since the church's earliest centuries. The smell of frankincense is everywhere, the pilgrims pressing close. They reach out to touch the ceremonial crosses as they pass. They press their foreheads against the carved stone walls of the churches. They fill every available space in the trenches and courtyards that surround the buildings, thousands of people in spaces that were never designed for thousands. This is not a tourist event. There are tourists present, and the tension between the tourist experience and the pilgrim experience is real and sometimes uncomfortable. But the center of what is happening is not for the tourists. The center of what is happening is for the pilgrims. It is an event of religious significance that has been occurring in essentially this form since the churches were built. The pilgrims come because they believe the churches are holy. They come because they believe that prayer offered here, at this place, in proximity to these stones, has a particular efficacy. They come because the connection to 9 centuries of unbroken faith is real and felt and meaningful. They come, in other words, because the churches work, not as engineering marvels, not as historical artifacts, not as tourist attractions, but as what they were built to be. Places where the distance between the human and the divine is smaller than usual, where the effort of spiritual attention is rewarded more reliably than elsewhere, where the accumulated faith of centuries has worn something into the stone that you can still feel when you press your hand against it. This is not mysticism. It is a straightforward phenomenological observation. Places that have been the sites of intense human attention over long periods develop a quality that is perceptible. You can feel it at Chartres Cathedral. You can feel it at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. You can feel it in the caves at Lascaux, where 30,000-year-old paintings still radiate the intensity of the attention that created them. At Lalibela, that quality is very strong. Part of it is the drama of the architecture. Part of it is the visual strangeness of buildings that emerge from the earth rather than rising above it. Part of it is the continuous human presence, the prayers and the incense and the drums that have filled this air since the 12th century. And part of it is something else, something that is harder to name, something that the builders put into the stone when they carved it, whatever their source of knowledge and inspiration. Something that has survived 900 years of weather and use and is still present, still palpable, still capable of stopping a visitor in their tracks and making them stand very still and pay attention. The pilgrims know this. They have known it for generations. That is why they come. There is a question about Lalibela that almost no one asks, because it sounds too much like science fiction. The question is this: what if the builders of Lalibela knew something about the material they were working with that we don't know? Stay with me. Volcanic tuff is a complex material. Its properties, the way it responds to cutting, the way it hardens on exposure to air, the way it interacts with water, the way it transmits sound and heat, are not fully simple. There may be properties of the material specific to the particular tuff found at Lalibela that could, in principle, be exploited in ways that are not immediately obvious. The builders of Lalibela were working with this material every day for generations. Their accumulated knowledge of how it behaved, under what conditions, in response to what treatments, would have been extraordinary. Is it possible that they developed a technique, or inherited a technique, that allowed them to work the rock more efficiently than simple chiseling? Is it possible that they knew something about how to treat the rock that made it temporarily more workable, easier to cut with precision? There are, in the broader archaeological literature, intriguing hints of exactly this kind of knowledge in other cultures and other contexts. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids and the builders of Sacsayhuaman in Peru both produce stonework of a precision that is difficult to account for with the tools they are known to have had. Both sites have attracted speculation about techniques that are no longer known. Some of this speculation is wild, but some of it has a basis in genuine materials science. There are real phenomena in the behavior of certain types of rock that could, if exploited by a sophisticated practitioner, produce effects that look inexplicable to observers who don't know about them. The most intriguing of these phenomena involves the use of acoustic vibration. Certain frequencies of sound can cause materials to behave in unusual ways. Granular materials, materials at or near a phase transition, materials with specific crystalline structures can, under the influence of particular acoustic frequencies, become temporarily more fluid, more malleable, more workable. This is not magic. It is physics. Specifically, it is the physics of resonance, of the way that vibration at the right frequency can cause a material's internal structure to rearrange. Could this have been relevant at Lalibela? Could the builders have used some form of acoustic treatment of the rock, perhaps combined with water or heat, to make the tuff temporarily more responsive to their tools? This is speculation. There is no direct evidence of such a technique being used at Lalibela. The idea exists in the category of interesting possibilities rather than established facts. But the category of interesting possibilities is not nothing. It is where the next generation of understanding comes from. The history of science is the history of interesting possibilities that turned out to be real. And there is one detail about the construction of Lalibela that continues to nag at the people who study it. One detail that doesn't fit any of the conventional explanations: the walls. In several sections of the churches, the walls show a degree of smoothness that is hard to account for with chisel work alone. Not polished, not mirror smooth, but smoother than you would expect from pure chiseling. Smoother and more consistent than the hand-worked surfaces in similar volcanic tuff at other sites. Some researchers attribute this to finishing work with abrasives, fine-grained stone rubbed across the surface to remove tool marks. This is plausible. Stone abrasion is a well-documented technique in many ancient architectural contexts. But the smoothness at Lalibela is slightly different in character from the smoothness produced by abrasion. It is not the flatness of a rubbed surface. It is the smoothness of a surface that was soft when it was shaped. Is this a property of the specific tuff at Lalibela responding to some treatment that made it temporarily soft? Is it a result of construction during particular climatic conditions that affected the material's behavior? Is it something else entirely? No one has a definitive answer. It is one more detail that the buildings give you without explanation. One more place where the gap between what was built and what we understand about how to build it is visible and present and unresolved. Let's go back to Lalibela himself. To the man rather than the legend, he had a vision. Whether you believe visions are real communications from the divine, or neurological events, or something in between, the vision was his primary motivation. He was shown something. He spent his life trying to reproduce it. This is not an unusual human experience. Artists and architects and engineers throughout history have described versions of this. The moment when the thing you're trying to make appears complete and clear in your mind before you've made it, when the finished work is more real in imagination than the unworked material in front of you. Michelangelo, carving his statues, said he was releasing the figures that were already present in the marble. The marble just needed to be cleared away. This is what Lalibela was doing. Not inventing the churches from scratch, not solving an engineering problem through trial and error, pursuing a vision, clearing away the rock to reveal something that was already there. When you work from a vision of the finished thing, you work differently than when you work from a plan that is still being developed. You know where you're going. You know what it looks like when it's right. You know when you've gone wrong. The vision is both the destination and the quality control mechanism. If Lalibela's vision was vivid enough, specific enough, held clearly enough in mind across decades of work, it could account for the consistency of the design across the different churches. Not a plan on paper. There may have been such a plan. We don't know. It doesn't survive. But a mental model, a spatial imagination, clear enough and stable enough to guide a workforce over decades. Great architects work this way. Great engineers work this way. The quality of the mental model determines the quality of the physical result. What was Lalibela's mental model? What did he see in those 3 days of poisoned sleep, traveling through the heavens with the angels? We know what he built. The buildings are the answer. They are the record of his vision, translated into stone, the closest thing we have to seeing what he saw. And what he saw, it turns out, was beautiful. Not beautiful in a decorative sense, beautiful in the deeper sense, coherent, resolved, ordered, true. The kind of beauty that comes from something being exactly what it is and exactly what it needed to be and nothing else. The churches of Lalibela are not trying to be anything. They are not trying to impress or overwhelm or demonstrate technical virtuosity. They are trying to be what they were always meant to be, places for the encounter between human beings and whatever is larger than human beings, places that hold a specific quality of attention and make it available to those who come with the right disposition. They succeed at this. After 900 years, they still succeed at this. That success is the strongest argument, not for angels exactly, but for something in the neighborhood of what the priests mean when they say angels. Something that knew what these buildings needed to be, and guided the hands that made them toward exactly that. Whatever you call it, there is one more church that deserves particular attention. Bete Abba Libanos is built into the face of a cliff. It is not a freestanding monolith like St. George's. Its rear and side walls are the cliff face itself. Only the front facade has been carved free. But the roof is a problem. The roof of Bete Abba Libanos is flat, which is typical of the Lalibela churches. What is not typical is how it connects to the cliff face at the rear. The roof meets the cliff in a way that is architecturally clean and precise. The junction between the carved architectural surface and the raw rock face is managed with a sophistication that suggests a very specific knowledge of what you're doing. More than that, the roof of Bete Abba Libanos appears to be carved from a single piece of rock that is separate from the walls below it, not attached at the sides, floating in architectural terms. This is called a hanging roof. It works because the roof slab is in compression, held in place by the geometry of the support rather than by any connection at the edges. The trick is in the geometry. Get it right, and the roof is stable. Get it wrong, and it falls. The roof of Bete Abba Libanos has not fallen. It has been hanging there, in compression, since the 12th century. The story associated with this church is that Lalibela's wife, Queen Meskel Kebra, built it in a single night, while Lalibela was asleep. She reportedly built it as a tribute to him, or as a contribution to the project that she felt was falling behind schedule. Depending on your interpretive framework, this story is either charming hagiography or an interesting data point. If it's a data point, it suggests that Lalibella's queen also had access to, or embodied in herself, the same extraordinary technical knowledge that the rest of the construction required. It suggests that the knowledge was not concentrated in one individual, but was distributed. That there was a community of practice around this project, a group of people who understood what needed to be done and could do it. A community of practice that achieved extraordinary things and then gradually dissolved. As communities of practice always do, when the conditions that created them change. The roof is still there. The queen's tribute to her husband, still in compression, still hanging, still, after 9 centuries, doing exactly what it was designed to do. What do you take away from Lalibela? Not the mystery, necessarily. The mystery is real, but mysteries don't resolve neatly, and the one at Lalibela is not going to resolve tonight. What you take away is something more specific, something the mystery points toward. You take away the fact that human beings, working with the materials and knowledge available to them in a particular time and place, produce something that continues to exceed our full understanding 900 years later. This should give us a different relationship to the past than the one we sometimes have. The past is not simply a less developed version of the present. It is not a place where people had fewer ideas and less capability and understood less. It is a place where people had different ideas, different capabilities, and understood different things. Some of what they understood, we understand better now. Some of what they understood, we have lost. The churches of Lalibela are the most dramatic possible illustration of this. They are proof, carved in red volcanic rock, that the assumption of linear progress from past ignorance to present knowledge is not a complete picture. They are evidence that the map of human understanding is not a simple slope upward. It is a landscape with peaks and valleys, heights and depths, and the highest points are not necessarily the most recent ones. They are also, and this matters just as much, a testament to what faith can do when it operates at full intensity. Not faith in the absence of reason, not faith as a substitute for knowledge, but faith as a motive force, a driving power, a reason to attempt the apparently impossible, and to keep attempting it across decades and generations until it is done. The priests who maintain the churches today are the heirs of that faith. They are the latest link in an unbroken chain that runs back to the 12th century, to the king who had the vision, to the workers who brought it into being in the rock of the Ethiopian highlands. They walk through tunnels carved 900 years ago, past walls worn smooth by the hands of 9 centuries of worshippers, into spaces whose proportions were determined by knowledge we cannot fully reconstruct, to perform a liturgy in a language that has been dead as a spoken tongue for 1,000 years and lives now only in these mountains, in these churches, in these voices. And they continue because the buildings ask them to, because the buildings are present and demanding and alive in a way that does not allow for abandonment, because whoever built them understood something about what buildings can be, what they can hold, what they can transmit across centuries, and they built in accordance with that understanding so deeply and so thoroughly that the understanding survived. That is the truest thing about Lalibela, not the mystery of how it was built, though the mystery is real. Not the question of whether angels were present, though the question is worth sitting with. The truest thing is simpler and more available than any of that. The truest thing is that someone, 900 years ago, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, was given a vision of what was possible, and they gave everything they had to make it real, and it still is. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly what I make these videos for. There's something about the deep past, about mysteries that have been present longer than we've been alive, that quiets the mind. It puts our particular moment in its right size. The churches at Lalibela were carved while the Crusades were happening, while Genghis Khan was beginning his campaigns, while the Gothic cathedrals of northern Europe were rising. The world was full of noise and violence and uncertainty, just as it always is. And in the middle of all that, someone went into the mountains and started carving churches out of the rock, and kept carving for decades, for generations, until the vision was complete. The world kept being noisy. The churches kept being carved. The churches are still there. Go to sleep now. The mystery will be there in the morning. Let's talk about water one more time, because there's something about the water at Lalibela that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The site is at 8,200 feet. The rainy season in northern Ethiopia brings significant precipitation to the highlands, enough to fill rivers and saturate the ground. The dry season brings months of minimal rainfall, when the same ground becomes parched and the springs that feed from underground water tables are the only reliable sources. Managing water at a site like Lalibela, both the abundance of the rainy season and the scarcity of the dry season, was a fundamental design challenge. The builders addressed it comprehensively. The drainage channels around the bases of the churches are the visible part of the water management system. They are impressive in themselves, carved from the same rock as the churches, integrated into the architectural composition rather than tacked on as an afterthought. They show a sophisticated understanding of how water moves across a complex landscape. But the less visible part of the water management system is more interesting. Underneath the site, or more precisely, running through the rock of the site, there is a network of channels and cisterns that was designed to collect, store, and distribute water from the rains to the dry season. These subsurface channels connect to the open drainage channels at the surface. They lead to storage chambers carved into the rock below the level of the churches. This subsurface system is not fully mapped. It was not fully described in the early archaeological surveys of the site. Its extent and complexity have only become clearer as modern ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed what lies beneath the surface. What they have revealed is that the engineering of Lalibela is substantially more extensive below ground than above. The rock beneath the site is honeycombed with chambers, channels, and passages. The density of carved space below the surface approaches, and in some areas exceeds, what is visible above. Some of these subsurface spaces are clearly functional. They are storage chambers, cisterns, passages connecting different parts of the site. Others are less clearly functional. Some chambers below the churches appear to have been ceremonial spaces, used for purposes that are no longer entirely clear. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves traditions about underground spaces at Lalibela, about the uses of particular chambers, about the significance of specific passages that are not fully accessible to outside researchers. This is appropriate. The knowledge belongs to the tradition that has maintained it. It is not required to be available to the curious, but it does mean that the full extent of what was built at Lalibela, the complete scope of the architectural achievement, is still not known. The churches you can visit, the 11 buildings above ground, may be the visible part of something considerably larger and more complex. The spring below the Church of St. George, accessible through the covered pit in the floor, may be connected to a more extensive underground water system than is currently mapped. The water that flows through that spring has been flowing for 900 years. It comes from somewhere. It goes somewhere. Its relationship to the broader hydrology of the site is not fully understood. The builders of Lalibela understood the water. They designed around it, designed for it, designed with it. They knew where it was, where it came from, where it went. They used that knowledge to make the buildings safe, stable, and supplied. 9 centuries later, we are still learning what they knew. There is a pattern in the study of ancient architecture that repeats across cultures and continents. Every time archaeologists or architects study a truly exceptional ancient building with sufficient care, they find the same thing. It is better than it initially appears. Not just good for its time, not just impressive given the tools available. Better. Better than it had any right to be. Better than a straightforward application of known techniques and available tools would produce. The Parthenon has subtle curves in its columns and floor that correct for optical distortions caused by perspective. Without these corrections, the building would look slightly wrong from a distance. With them, it looks exactly right. The corrections require a sophisticated understanding of how human visual perception works and a construction process precise enough to implement curves measured in fractions of an inch across a building 60 feet wide. The Great Pyramid has an internal structure, a series of chambers and passages, whose layout has been compared by structural engineers to the design of a modern earthquake-resistant building. The specific distribution of mass and void, of solid and hollow, distributes seismic forces in a way that is as effective as anything a modern engineer would design for the same purpose. No one in the ancient world had a theory of earthquake engineering, but someone built a pyramid that happens to be extraordinarily earthquake-resistant. The Nazca lines in Peru include among their geometric figures patterns that are accurate to within a fraction of a degree over distances of miles. Without the ability to see the patterns from the air, which the Nazca people did not have, maintaining that level of accuracy requires a mathematical and surveying technique that we have not yet fully reconstructed. Lalibela fits this pattern. The more carefully you study it, the more impressive it becomes. The drainage system works better than it needs to. The structural engineering is more sophisticated than it needs to be. The spatial proportions are more refined than they need to be. The acoustic properties of the interior spaces, and yes, the churches have been studied acoustically, and the results are interesting, are more precisely calibrated than coincidence would produce. This pattern, repeated across cultures, across centuries, across continents, is either a series of coincidences or it is evidence of something. It is evidence, most parsimoniously interpreted, that the ancient world contained more technical and scientific knowledge than we have assumed, not modern technical knowledge. Not knowledge that worked from the same theoretical foundations as modern science, but systematic, accumulated, tested knowledge of how things work, preserved in practice and in building traditions, capable of producing results that remain impressive to people with much more explicit theoretical understanding. This knowledge was fragile. It depended on continuous practice, on chains of transmission, on conditions of social stability and material prosperity that were always precarious. Civilizations collapse. Knowledge that was only embodied in practice, never written down, never formalized, never made explicitly transmissible, dies when the civilization that practiced it dies. The mystery of Lalibela is, in this sense, the mystery of lost knowledge, not a mystery about angels, though the angel story is worth keeping in mind as a pointer toward the genuine puzzlement that the buildings produce, but a mystery about what it is possible to know, what it is possible to build, when the conditions for a particular kind of knowing are present. Those conditions are rare. They appear briefly, in particular places and times, and produce their monuments, and pass. What remains is the monument. The knowledge that made it is gone, but the monument is still here, still standing in its pit in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, still in use, still carving a space in the air where the ancient meets the present and asks you to consider what you know and what you don't. Still waiting, in the most literal possible sense, for its builders to be understood. One thing you cannot get from a photograph of Lalibela is the sound. The sound is important. The chant of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is old, very old. The musical tradition of the church traces its origins to Yared, a 6th century saint who is said to have received the melodies of the liturgical chant directly from angels, who sang them to him in the form of bird song. The tradition holds that the 3 birds, representing the 3 persons of the Trinity, sang 3 modes of chant to Yared, who transcribed them and taught them to the church. The chant that fills the churches of Lalibela today is, in its essential forms, the chant that Yared received. It has been modified and elaborated over 14 centuries of continuous practice, but its core modes, its characteristic melodic movements, its specific relationship between melody and liturgical text are ancient. The sound is unlike Western chant. It is unlike Byzantine chant. It has a quality that is specific to itself, to this particular tradition, to this particular language. Ge'ez is a rich phonetic language, with consonants that don't exist in European languages, vowels that carry expressive weight, a prosodic character that shapes the music that carries it. The sound of this chant in the interior space of a Lalibela church is not an experience that can be adequately described. It fills the space in a specific way, resonating with the proportions of the room, finding the particular frequencies that the stone amplifies. The acoustic studies of the churches have found that the interior spaces have resonant frequencies in ranges that are particularly characteristic of the chant, suggesting, though not proving, that the architects took the acoustic properties of the liturgical music into account when designing the spaces. Whether intentional or coincidental, the effect is that the music belongs to the space and the space belongs to the music. They were made for each other, even if the making was not consciously coordinated. When you stand in Bete Medhane Alim and hear the liturgy chanted in the original mode, the sound filling the carved stone interior, the frankincense smoke making the light visible as it drifts through the narrow windows cut in the thick walls, the drums beating the rhythm in the courtyard outside, you understand something that no amount of historical research fully prepares you for. This was the point. All of it. The engineering, the geometry, the carving, the water management, the structural sophistication, all of it was in service of this moment. The moment when a human voice rises in a carved stone room and something happens that would not happen in the same voice in the open air without the stone around it. The buildings are musical instruments, not metaphorically, literally. They were designed to produce a specific acoustic environment in which a specific kind of human activity, the liturgical chant of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, would resonate in a specific way. The builders understood this. They built it in. It is still there, after 900 years. The instrument still plays. When you understand that, the question of whether angels were present during the construction becomes less important than the question of what kind of human being is capable of imagining and then building something like this. The answer, in the case of Lalibela and his builders, seems to be the kind of human being who has been given a vision of what is possible and who refuses to stop until the vision is real. That kind of human being is rare, but they exist. They have always existed, and the work they leave behind is still singing 900 years later in the mountains of Ethiopia. The sun sets slowly over the highlands of northern Ethiopia. The light turns amber, then gold, then a deep red that stains the volcanic rock, a color that seems to come from within rather than without. In the pit of St. George's Church, a priest is completing the evening prayer. His voice rises through the geometric crosses carved in the roof and into the cooling air above. The sound travels out over the town and over the hillsides and disperses into the enormous silence of the highland evening. The stars appear. At 8,200 feet, with little light pollution, the stars appear in numbers and with a clarity that is shocking if you are used to urban skies. The Milky Way is visible. The Southern Cross is visible. The constellation patterns that were old before the churches were built are old still. In the morning, the priests will rise before dawn and descend again to the churches. The drums will beat. The frankincense will burn. The chant will begin again, and the rock, cut from the mountain by hands that understood what they were doing in ways we do not fully understand, will stand as it has stood, will hold the space as it has held it, will sing with the music as it has sung. 900 years. The buildings that cannot be explained still stand. The knowledge that built them is mostly gone. The faith that preserved them is still present. And somewhere in the middle of these three things, in the space between the engineering and the mystery and the faith, is the thing that Lalibela was trying to build. Not just a church, not just a shelter, not just a monument. A meeting place. A place where what is human and what is beyond human could meet regularly, reliably, across centuries. He built it. It works. That's all you need to know. Good night.